The knock came 3 times, perfectly spaced. It was the sound of someone who knew they owned the ground they stood on. Joan Fletcher set down her inkwell, walked across the chilly hardwood floor in her wool stockings, and opened the heavy oak door of Riverwood House. Standing on the threshold was Raymond Montgomery. The valley had whispered about him for years, though few had seen him close. He was a man of striking, unnatural features, hair as white as fresh winter snow, and skin so pale it seemed carved from fine marble. He wore a long dark coat that made the wide doorway look small. His eyes were a pale, icy gray, completely unblinking. Behind him, his carriage horses exhaled thick plumes of steam into the October frost. The afternoon sun was already sinking, turning the sky the color of dried amber. "I am here to see Mr. Fletcher," he said. His voice was remarkably low, carrying a quiet authority that needed no extra volume. Joan knew exactly why he had come. It was the debt. For 12 months, the debt had been the third person living in this house. It was present in the stacks of unopened letters on her father's desk. It was present in the blank spaces on the walls where the family portraits used to hang. It was present in the way their staff had dwindled from 5 people to 3, and finally, to none at all. "My father is not taking visitors," Joan said, keeping her voice steady. "Then I will wait until he is," Raymond replied. "You will wait a very long time, Mr. Montgomery. He left for the springs in Saratoga this morning. He claimed his nerves required the mineral waters." She did not add the truth that her father's nerves had magically improved the moment he put 2 days of travel between himself and this conversation. "I am his daughter. Whatever business you have with him, you can do with me." A flicker of surprise passed through his icy gray eyes, then vanished behind a mask of perfect composure. He had clearly expected a frightened old gentleman. He had expected an easy surrender. He had not expected her. "Miss Fletcher, this is not a matter for a young woman. I keep the ledger, sir. I have kept it since I was 19. I know down to the last penny exactly what this estate owes you, which is far more than my father knows." She stepped back, pulling the door wide open. The crisp autumn air rushed past her into the empty hall, but she did not shudder. "You can stand on my porch and let every passing farmer gossip about you, or you can come inside. There is a fire in the library and exactly 1 chair that hasn't been sold." Raymond did not move for a long moment. His pale eyes scanned her face, noting the ink stains on her fingers and her faded wool dress. It was a gown that had been fashionable 3 seasons ago. Her chin remained level by pure force of will. Then the white-haired man stepped over the threshold of the house he was legally about to inherit. Joan looked him dead in the eye and said, "Name your terms." He did not answer immediately. That was the first thing she learned about him as they stood in the library, with the solitary armchair sitting between them like an umpire. He was a man who observed before he spoke, and when he did speak, he used very few words. Joan used the quiet moment to take her own inventory of him. Despite his white hair, his face was smooth-looking, no older than 28. Yet there was an immense weight to his presence, a stillness that felt centuries old. He smelled of the autumn woods, dry leaves, pine smoke, and cold leather. Underneath those scents was something cleaner, like cedar wood. He stood with his weight perfectly balanced, a large man who had clearly learned how not to tower over ordinary people. The library had been Joan's favorite room. She had defended it fiercely through a year of selling off their belongings. The fine rugs had gone in February. The grandfather clock was sold in June. But the 3,000 books remained on their shelves, surrounding the small fireplace and the wide window that looked out onto a wild, overgrown garden. "You manage the books," Raymond said, looking at the shelves rather than her. "Both kinds. Joan walked to the small writing desk by the window. A heavy leather ledger lay closed on the wood. If you mean the financial books, the balance stands at $13,000, including the interest my father stopped paying in April. If you mean the reading books, I have read most of them. A faint movement caught the corner of Raymond's mouth. In an ordinary man, it would have been the beginning of a smile. You are very composed for a woman whose home is forfeit. Weeping has never once reduced a debt. Mr. Montgomery and I have tried weeping. She hadn't actually cried since the day the clock was wheeled out, and she had no intention of doing it now. I prefer to know exactly what I am facing. You hold $13,000 of my family's paper. You came to take the property. Tell me what that looks like. He turned fully toward her. His movements were fluid and entirely silent. The contract your father signed 8 months ago transfers the house, the home farm, and the 3 tenant properties to me if the debt remains unpaid, Raymond stated flatly. The time has expired. I am taking possession. Joan felt a cold dread settle in her stomach. Knowing a fact was one thing. Hearing this pale, powerful man state it in her library was another. And what about me? She asked. I am not listed in the deed. I am not property, Mr. Montgomery. No, he agreed. You are not. Then where am I supposed to go? It was the one question she hadn't been able to answer for herself, and she hated that she had to ask it of him. She saw him notice the slight crack in her voice, and she saw him choose not to exploit it. That, Raymond said, is the exact matter I came to discuss, and I find I would prefer to do so while sitting down. Joan pointed to the armchair. It was the last piece of comfort left in the house, and she would offer it like a queen. She sat down on the wide wooden windowsill, her back to the wild garden, and folded her hands over the closed ledger. Raymond sat down. He did not look entirely comfortable. A man of his stature rarely did in furniture built for ordinary people. My family council, Raymond began, is determined to see me married before the winter solstice. They have selected a candidate. Her name is Lady Cynthia. She possesses a very large inheritance, and she would make my life a perfectly run, freezing misery. My family does not care about my comfort. They care about tradition. My condolences, Joan said dryly. But I fail to see how that involves me. I require a wife who can manage the vast affairs of my estate. Raymond said, his pale eyes locking onto hers. Someone with enough nerve to stand in a room full of my relatives and not turn to dust. You opened the door to a creditor and demanded his terms before he could even take off his hat. I think you will do perfectly. The room went completely silent except for the ticking of the fire. Let me be certain I understand, Joan said slowly. You are offering to cancel my father's debt and leave me my home in exchange for a wife who will manage your accounts and face your family. I am offering you the position of my wife, Raymond said. The debt will be erased as part of the marriage agreement. It is a business transaction, Miss Fletcher. I am quite good at those. And love. The word escaped her mouth before she could stop it. She had intended to be just as cold and practical as he was. Love, Raymond said, is not included in the deed. Good, Joan replied, though she did not entirely believe him. Then we should get along fine. She opened the ledger to a blank page, dipped her pen into the inkwell, and looked up at him. Name your terms, sir. Then I will name mine. Raymond had not expected her to have terms. She saw the brief flash of amusement and respect cross his pale face. It was an expression he clearly didn't wear often. Joan noted it down mentally. A woman selling her future to save a house needed to know her exact worth, and she had decided she was worth quite a bit. My first term, Joan said, is this library. It does not become part of your general estate. It stays mine. And this house must be deeded directly to me, not to you. If you grow tired of this transaction, I will not be thrown out of my own rooms by a man I no longer useful to. You think I will grow tired of you. I think a sensible woman does not sign away her roof based on a stranger's good opinion of himself. The house must be in my name. That is the first condition. Raymond inclined his head slightly. Granted. My second term is the truth. Always. I will not tolerate lies in my marriage, no matter how convenient they might be. If your family asks if this is a love match, you will not pretend. You will tell them it is none of their business. I have spent a year living in a house built entirely on my father's deception, and I have no desire to live in that kind of architecture again. A shadow crossed his face at that. It wasn't anger. It looked more like recognition, though it vanished before she could fully read it. Granted, he said, his voice dropping lower. My third term. Joan continued pausing because this was the most critical condition, is time. Your contract has sat in a drawer for 8 months. A man of your resources does not wait 8 months for $13,000 unless he has a reason. You came today because your family set a deadline. I will not be a woman you marry out of spite and discard later. We will be engaged for 3 months before any vows are spoken. During those 3 months, you will spend your Thursdays and Sundays here at Riverwood. You will let me see exactly what kind of man I am marrying. If either of us wants to walk away at the end of those 3 months, the debt remains cancelled. The house remains mine, and you may marry Lady Cynthia with my blessings. The fire popped in the grate. Raymond sat perfectly still, evaluating her like a clause in a difficult contract that he couldn't quite bypass. You drive a very hard bargain, Miss Fletcher, he said at last. I drive the only bargain available to a woman with empty pockets and a roof full of someone else's debts. Hardness is all I have left. Do you agree? For a long moment she thought he would refuse. She watched him weigh the cost, the delay, and the sheer indignity of being inspected like a carriage horse by a penniless girl. She held her breath and forced herself to sit perfectly still. If she moved, she might lose everything. Granted, Raymond said. He stood up, his massive frame instantly filling the small room. A dry, low note entered his voice. Tell me, do you negotiate everything this way? Or did I simply catch you on a generous day? The question was so unexpected that Joan let out a short, startled laugh. It was gone as quickly as it came, but Raymond heard it. His gray eyes captured the sound, registering it the way a man notices a strange light in a dark house. Joan rose quickly and closed the ledger to hide her face. Everything, Mr. Montgomery. Just ask the village butcher. She walked him to the front door, the door that was now by virtue of 3 conditions and a handshake going to remain hers. She watched his carriage roll down the driveway into the fading October light, its lanterns glowing gold against the graying afternoon. She stood on the porch a moment longer than necessary, letting the warmth of the library fire slip past her into the dark, listening to the wheels fade down the road. He returned the following Thursday, and he came completely alone. Joan had expected a man of his status to travel with a massive display helper's drivers and a legal team. Instead, he arrived in a plain, open buggy that he drove himself. He walked up to the house with mud on his boots and a heavy leather case of papers tucked under his arm. He looked less like a wealthy gentleman coming to court a lady, and more like an auditor arriving to inspect a failing business, which Joan realized was exactly what he was doing. Your home farm is being swindled, he said by way of greeting before he even wiped his boots. I checked the northern boundary fence on my way here. There are 40 acres of your best grazing land currently fenced inside your neighbor's property, and that fence has been there for a long time. I know, Joan replied flatly. Raymond stopped in his tracks. You know, our old land manager, Mr. Higgins, sold the use of that land to our neighbor 3 years ago and kept the money for himself. Joan explained, taking the muddy leather case from his hands and setting it on the hall table. When my father discovered it, he did nothing. Higgins knew about my father's heavy gambling debts, and my father was terrified of exposure. I have the dates, the recorded amounts, and Higgins's own signatures. He is a thief, but not a particularly clever one. I have been waiting 3 years for someone with the legal authority to do something about it. Welcome to Riverwood, sir. It appears you are that someone. Raymond looked at her across the empty stripped hallway. Something changed in his pale features. He had come prepared to be patient with a helpless girl, but he had found an experienced accountant instead. Show me, he said. They sat at the writing table by the library window, with the leather case open between them. For 2 hours they spoke of nothing but land laws, boundaries, and the systematic removal of Mr. Higgins. She provided the documents. He provided the legal force. She knew exactly where the secrets were hidden. He knew which local judge to wake up and how hard to press. By the time the afternoon light turned amber over the wild yard, they had built a legal trap that neither could have constructed alone. Joan looked up from a column of fraudulent figures and found Raymond watching her. "What is it?" she asked. "Nothing," he said, returning his gaze to the paperwork. "You actually enjoy this." "I enjoy seeing a thief get caught. I enjoy seeing a wrong corrected. I have spent a full year seeing exactly what was broken in this house and being unable to fix a single brick because I am a woman with no money and no legal standing. Now, there is someone who will listen to me. It turns out he is very large, rather unsettling and engaged to me. I intend to use his power without any mercy while it lasts." "Is that an answer, sir?" Raymond was quiet for a moment. "My name is Raymond," he said softly. "If we are going to be ruthless partners, you should use it. The formal titles are for public show." "Raymond?" She tried the name out. It felt warmer than she expected for such a cold individual. "Then you had better call me Joan, or people will think you hired me." "My family," Raymond said with a dry weariness that she was beginning to recognize as his version of humor, "believes everyone I associate with has been hired. They assume no one would spend time with me otherwise." He gathered the papers into a neat stack. "I will have Higgins removed by the end of the week. I will return on Sunday." He paused at the library door. The amber light caught the silver-white hair at his temples, making him look ancient and youthful all at once. "You were right about the deadline, Joan. My family did set a date. I had not intended to come here until that exact day. But I am very glad I came early." He left before she could decide if the strange warmth in her chest was relief victory or something she had absolutely no business feeling yet. Mr. Higgins was legally removed on Monday morning. Joan was not there to see it. Raymond had insisted that a legal confrontation with a crooked manager was no place for a lady, and Joan had agreed only on the condition that she be told every single detail afterward. On Thursday, he sat in her mother's armchair drinking the cheap tea she could afford, as if it were the finest blend, and told her the whole story. "He actually wept," Raymond said calmly. "He stood in his kitchen and claimed the entire land theft was your father's idea. He said the 40 acres had practically moved into the neighbor's property on their own. I let him run out of tears, and then I laid your files on his table." "Did you tell him they were mine?" "I told him the absolute truth," Raymond said. "I told him there was a young woman who had kept the true records of Riverwood for 3 years while he rubbed it blind. I told him he wasn't caught by a wealthy investor, but by a young woman with an excellent memory and a superior filing system, He went entirely gray. Joan turned toward the window so he wouldn't see her expression. The first winter frost had arrived during the night, dusting the overgrown boxwood hedges with a silver coating that made the ruined garden look almost grand. She realized this was the truly dangerous part of their arrangement. It wasn't the debt or the marriage. It was this a man who kept his promises perfectly, a man who handed her the credit she had earned. A woman could easily lose her heart to someone like that, and Joan had spent a year building a self-defense system specifically designed to avoid that kind of loss. The 40 acres have been legally returned to Riverwood. Raymond continued behind her. The boundary fence comes down before the first heavy snow. Your property is whole again, Joan. I have completed the task you required, and I find I would like to request something in return. And what is that? Walk with me in the garden, he said. The frost has made the ruins look beautiful. I have been a landlord all week, and I would like 15 minutes of being neither. She turned around. He was standing by the armchair with his hands tucked behind his back, looking unusually uncertain. It was that specific uncertainty that broke her resolve. The discovery that this powerful man, who terrified dishonest managers and moved thousands of dollars with a pen stroke, was unsure if she would walk with him in a backyard. No negotiations needed, Joan said. But you will have to give me your arm at the broken steps. The frost makes the wood slick, and I only have one pair of good winter shoes left. I refuse to ruin them by tumbling into a hedge. Nothing extraordinary happened during that walk. They simply moved along the silver paths of the ruined property, talking about old books and winter crops. His arm was rock-steady under her hand as they navigated the slick steps. Yet by the time the sun went down behind the overgrown green walls, everything had subtly shifted between them. The library felt different after that day. To an outsider, the room looked exactly the same 3,000 books, the same solitary chair, the same view of the yard. But to Joan, the space had transformed. For 12 months, the room had been her bunker. She had sat there alone through long, freezing evenings, keeping the fire low to save wood. It had smelled of old paper and dust. The quiet inside it had been the tense silence of someone waiting for a blow to fall. It had been hers simply because there was no one else left to claim it. Now, on Thursdays and Sundays, the room smelled of cedar wood and fresh winter air. There were two distinct voices filling the quiet. The dust on the table was disturbed by open maps and ledgers. The silence was no longer heavy. It had become the comfortable shared quiet of two people reading by the same hearth fire. She caught herself on Wednesday afternoons, arranging the room for his arrival, setting out a second cup, saving the cleanest candle, leaving out a specific philosophy book where his hand would easily find it. She would catch herself doing these things, stop dead in the middle of the room, and realize with a shock that she was no longer keeping the room just for herself. October ended in cold rain, and November arrived with heavy gray skies. The rhythm of her weeks became entirely centered around those 2 days when the plain buggy turned into the driveway. Joan told herself with great severity every Saturday night that she was not waiting for him. She was simply tracking the days. What they did during those visits was practical work. That was the strange, unromantic truth of their engagement. The white-haired landlord and his broke bride spent the autumn over a wooden table rebuilding a broken property piece by piece. When the home farm needed a new overseer, Raymond didn't simply hire someone from his own vast properties. He sat at the table while Joan laid out the local candidates. Candidate background, Joan's assessment. The Hartmore man, slow, traditional farmer. Honest, but lacks initiative, the village clerk. Highly intelligent, sharp potential, to be as crooked as Higgins, the widow's son. Hardworking, inexperienced, possesses absolute integrity. "Which one do you want?" Raymond asked after she finished reading the profiles. "The widow's son," Joan said without hesitation. "He doesn't have the experience of the clerk, but he has the kind of character that won't sell your land out from under you." Raymond simply nodded, dipped his pen, and wrote out the employment offer in his own handwriting. "You didn't argue with my choice," she noted, watching him press his seal into the wax. "You were right," Raymond said simply. "I have an entire council of relatives who argue with me daily, Joan. I do not need a wife who argues for the sake of it. I need someone who is clear-headed and correct. It is a completely new experience for me." Joan let out a genuine laugh. The sound drifted up toward the high, dark bookshelves, making the old library feel alive for a moment. They rode across the property lines when the weather cleared. Raymond showed her how to spot a poorly dug drainage ditch, and she showed him which families were behind on their rent because their soil had failed rather than because they were lazy. It was a distinction her father had never bothered to learn, and one that Raymond had never been taught. One afternoon, a sudden freezing downpour forced them to seek shelter inside an old stone hay barn. They stood close together in the dark space, surrounded by the smell of dry hay and wet wool, watching the gray rain sheet across the fields. They didn't speak for 20 minutes. Joan was intensely aware of his physical presence beside her. He was the only source of solid, unyielding strength in a very cold world. She was the one who stepped away first. She always stepped away first. By the second week of November, the old river dam broke after 3 solid days of freezing rain. Joan woke at 3 o'clock in the morning to a deep, changing roar in the dark. It was the sound of the river moving at a dangerous volume. Beneath that noise came a frantic hammering on her kitchen door. She ran down the cold stairs in her nightgown, a single candle flickering wildly in her hand. When she pulled the bolt back, the wind drove the rain straight into the hallway. Standing on the porch was the new young overseer, completely drenched and pale with fear. The river had smashed through the old wooden sluice gate. The water was rushing directly toward the 3 low-lying tenant cottages, the exact homes that had almost been lost to the debt. If the main mill pond gave way next, those houses would be submerged to their roofs before sunrise, destroying every bit of the winter food supplies. Joan did not panic, she did not cry, and she did not wait for someone to save them. She ran upstairs, changed into her thickest wool dress in less than 2 minutes, and went out into the black storm with a single lantern. For the next 4 hours, Joan Fletcher fought the river. She had no money, no legal title, and no army of workers. She had only the authority of the person who refused to run away. She woke up the home farm families, gathered the men by the light of her lantern, and directed them toward the high spillway. Her voice stayed clear and hard over the sound of the rushing water. "Open the upper floodgate," she shouted into the wind. "Let the water drain into the lower hay meadow. Sacrifice the winter hay crops, but save the houses." The water responded to the open gate, with sudden violent force roaring into the empty fields, and leaving the cottages with only inches of mud to spare. Joan waded directly into the freezing current, her long skirts soaking through until they felt like lead weights against her legs. She carried sacks of seed grain out of a flooding barn on her own shoulders, going back into the dark repeatedly until the supplies were safe in a high stone barn. By dawn, the rain had stopped, leaving a bitter gray mist over the valley. Joan stood in the mud, counting heads by the dying light of her lantern to make sure every person was safe. Her hands were bleeding and raw from the rough wood of the grain sacks. Her feet were completely numb. Her dress was ruined, covered in black mud to the waist. But the cottages were standing. The grain was dry, and the families were safe. The sound of horses tearing down the muddy road broke the quiet. The overseer had sent a rider to Raymond's estate at the first sign of the break, and Raymond had driven his horses through the pitch-black night to reach her. He stepped down into the flooded lane and saw her standing there, soaked, covered in mud, holding a smoking lantern, still verifying the safety of her people. He didn't say a word at first. He simply walked through the water and looked at her face. Joan was too exhausted to hide her vulnerability. He saw the deep weariness, the raw capability, and the absolute determination of a woman who had saved an entire village by herself. "I sent for your men," she said, her teeth clicking together from the cold. "In case the main field flooded. We didn't need them. I managed it. Everyone is safe, Raymond. I counted every soul." "I know you did," Raymond said. His low voice shook slightly. He took the cold iron lantern from her fingers, set it on a dry rock, and gathered both of her freezing hands into his own large, incredibly warm hands. They stood together in the morning mist as the blood began to return to her fingers like needles of ice. She did not pull away from him. "There isn't a landlord in this state who could have done what you did tonight, Joan," he said, his grip tightening gently. "I have seen men twice your size break under far less pressure. You made the hard choice in seconds in the dark, entirely alone. I came to protect you, but I find you had already saved everyone." "The winter hay is totally gone," she whispered, her strength finally failing. "It was our best crop." "To hell with the hay," Raymond said. It was the first time she had ever heard him use an oath, and the sheer shock of it made her let out a tired, broken laugh. Raymond did something he had never done before. He pulled her directly against his chest, wrapping his heavy wool coat around her soaked shoulders. He didn't ask for anything. He simply offered a shield against the wind. Joan let herself lean into him because she had no energy left to stand alone. And for the first time in her life, she didn't want to step away. Raymond's elder relative, Lady Beatrice, arrived unannounced near the end of November. She traveled in a massive black carriage bearing the family coat of arms. Joan, who had been warned by Raymond, went out to meet her on the stone steps. She wore her old wool dress, her posture perfectly straight, her hands completely steady. "So," Lady Beatrice said as she stepped down from the carriage, "this is the girl who caused all the trouble." She was a compact, elegantly dressed woman of 60 with the exact same icy gray eyes as Raymond. Her face had the sharp beauty of someone who had long ago realized that power was far more useful than charm. She inspected Joan the way an expert appraises an item with a known defect. "Show me the house," Beatrice commanded. "I want to see exactly what my relative is risking his reputation to protect." "The house has very little left inside it, madam," Joan said, calmly opening the door. "We sold the main carpets, the clocks, and most of the furniture. You are welcome to the single good chair in the library, which is the only seat fitting for someone of your rank. I will stand, as I have become quite practiced at it." Beatrice stopped in the bare hallway. She looked at Joan as if seeing a real human being for the first time, rather than a financial problem. "You are not afraid of me. I am thoroughly intimidated by you, madam. But I have learned that being intimidated and being broken are two entirely different things, and I refuse the second on principle. Raymond told me you would try to frighten me. I thought it best to show you exactly who I am from the very beginning." The hallway went dead quiet. Then Lady Beatrice, the woman who had reportedly reduced state officials to absolute silence, sat down in the solitary library chair and began to laugh. "Raymond told me you were unusual," Beatrice said, once she stopped. "He underrepresented the situation." She accepted a cup of Joan's cheap tea without a single complaint, which Joan recognized as a massive victory. Over the next 2 hours, the older woman examined everything: the estate ledgers, the documents regarding the land theft, and Joan herself. Her sharp eyes missed nothing: the ink on Joan's fingers, the faded spots on the wallpaper, the steady level of Joan's chin. "I came here to end this engagement," Beatrice said flatly, folding her gloved hands. Lady Cynthia is a simple creature, but she is wealthy, predictable, and safe. A man in Raymond's position needs stability. You are completely unpredictable, Joan. You are the most disruptive young woman I have encountered in 40 years. If you marry him, you will keep him off balance for the rest of his days. Very likely, madam, Joan replied. Yes, Beatrice said, and a rare warmth appeared in her gray eyes. And he needs that desperately. He has been acting like an old man since he was 12 years old, and it has almost turned him to stone. I will not stop this marriage. Instead, I will make myself incredibly difficult in public so no one suspects I approved. You will manage me because you seem to manage everything else. Do we understand each other? Perfectly, madam, Joan said. When Raymond arrived the following Thursday, Joan told him about the visit. He let out a rare, genuine laugh that changed his entire face. She laughed, Raymond repeated, his eyes bright. The last time my relative laughed in this valley was a decade ago. She genuinely respects you, Joan. He reached into his heavy coat and pulled out a small flat package wrapped in plain brown paper. He placed it on the writing table and stepped back. This is not a gift. A gift would violate your terms and you would suspect me of trying to influence your judgment. This is simply a return of stolen property. Joan unwrapped the paper. Inside was a small painting in an old gold frame, a portrait of her mother as a young woman possessing the exact same gray eyes and level chin. It had been sold in March to pay an urgent debt bill. I found it in a shop 2 towns over, Raymond said softly, watching her face. The shopkeeper had it in a bin of nameless items. I recognized your chin immediately. I have spent a lot of time looking at your chin, Joan. I would know it anywhere. Joan held the small frame in both hands. She did not cry because she had promised herself she would never weep in front of a creditor, but she came closer to it than ever before. Raymond turned his back to her, looking out the window at the garden, giving her the privacy to regain her composure. Thank you, she said finally. It is not a matter for thanks, Raymond said without turning around. It falls under our second term, the truth. The truth is that your mother's likeness was sold to satisfy a debt that eventually came to me. A debt should not cost a daughter her mother's face. I bought it back because it belongs here. It is not a gift, and it has nothing to do with love, which is not in our contract. It is simply what was right. Joan looked at his broad back, realizing that the defenses she had built so carefully were completely useless against a man who insisted on being entirely fair. At the beginning of December, the rumors turned into an open legal attack. Lady Cynthia had not accepted the situation quietly. She had gone to the local county magistrate and laid a formal charge of fraud. She claimed that Joan had intentionally falsified the estate ledgers to invent a fake debt crisis, thereby tricking the wealthy Raymond Montgomery into an unnecessary marriage contract to save her family from a non-existent ruin. Worse, the magistrate was an old family friend of the Cynthias. He had scheduled a formal public hearing for the day after Christmas, a time when Raymond would be trapped on the other side of the state, attending to his family's mandatory winter council meetings. She wants to destroy your reputation before Raymond can return. Lady Beatrice told Joan, her carriage covered in fresh snow. The roads from the northern capital are already blocked by the blizzard. Raymond cannot possibly get back in time. If you stand in that courtroom alone, the valley will believe you are a fraud who needed to be rescued. Then he must stay there. Joan said, her voice dropping into that familiar cold competence that always surfaced during a crisis. Tell him not to try the roads, madam. If he forces his way back to stand beside me, everyone will say the wealthy man had to save his broke bride from her own crimes. The entire point of this arrangement was that I would be a wife who could stand on her own feet. I will go to the hearing alone. Joan, Beatrice warned, if the judge decides against you, the contract is broken. You will lose the house, and Raymond will be legally barred from completing the marriage. I have Higgins's signed confessions, Joan said, lifting her chin. I have 3 years of verified receipts. I have the original loan deeds signed by my father 8 months before I ever met Raymond. I do not need a protector. I needed $13,000 and a man who would listen to my evidence. I have already had the listening. I will do the rest myself. The 2 days leading up to the hearing were the loneliest of her life. The snow fell continuously, burying the garden, freezing the river solid, and cutting Riverwood House off from the rest of the world. Joan sat in her mother's armchair by the dying fire, holding the small portrait in her hands, talking to the quiet rooms. She felt like an absolute fool. She had built her entire life on the principle of expecting the worst, so she would never be caught off guard. Yet she had let her guard down anyway. She had fallen for a man who held her family's future in his hands, and now the winter storm had cut him off completely. On the morning of the hearing, Joan woke before dawn. She broke the ice in her water pitcher, dressed in her finest wool gown, packed her ledgers into the leather case, and walked the 3 miles through the deep snow to the county courthouse, alone. The main room was packed to the walls. The local families had gathered eager to see the proud Joan Fletcher publicly disgraced. At the front of the room, looking flawless in blue silk, sat Lady Cynthia. She offered Joan a small, pitying smile that said the outcome had already been decided. "Miss Fletcher," the judge said, refusing to look her in the eye, "you are accused of manipulating financial records to entrap a wealthy citizen into a marriage agreement under false pretenses. What do you have to say?" Joan did not ask for permission to speak. She stepped directly to the center table, unbuckled her leather case, and began to systematically dismantle the entire accusation in a flat, clear voice. Evidence, Item 1. The original debt deeds, signed solely by her father, dated nearly a year prior. Evidence Item 2. The certified bank records from the town clerk matching the unpaid interest amounts exactly. Evidence Item 3. Mr. Higgins's signed confession witnessed by the local sheriff proving the land theft was real. The charge is that I invented a debt to trap a husband. Joan said, her voice ringing clearly through the silent room. But the debt was signed before I ever met him. The theft was committed before I ever met him. The files that prove his ownership were kept in this building before I ever met him. I did not invent a single figure. I only counted the true cost of my father's choices, while everyone else chose to look away. You may rule against me if you wish, but you will be ruling against the math, not against me. The room remained completely silent. The judge looked at the piles of indisputable receipts, looked at Lady Cynthia, and realized that if he ruled against Joan in front of the entire town, his own career would be finished. "The charges," the judge muttered unhappily, "are dismissed for lack of evidence." Joan packed her ledgers into her case with trembling hands. She had won completely yet. As she walked out of the heavy brick building into the freezing winter air, she felt entirely hollow. She had proved her innocence, but she was still completely alone. She walked about 100 yards down the snowy road before her legs finally gave out, and she had to lean against a wooden fence, shaking from the delayed shock. Then she heard the sound of approaching horses. A plain buggy came tearing around the bend of the snowy road, its horses covered in sweat and ice. Raymond Montgomery jumped down into the deep drifts before the wheels had even stopped turning. He had driven through the entire night, breaking through the snow-choked passes from the capital. His white hair was wild, his face was pale with exhaustion, and his coat was covered in frost. He stopped just a foot away from her, his breathing heavy in the cold air. "It is over," Joan said, forcing her voice to remain steady. "The judge dismissed the case. I proved everything. You didn't need to risk your life on the roads, Raymond. If the town sees you here now—" "To hell with the town," Raymond said, using that oath for the second time. He looked down at her with a desperate intensity she had never seen in him before. "I did not drive through a blizzard to save your case, Joan. I drove through the night because my relative sent word 3 days ago, and I realized I had spent 100 miles of dark road thinking about exactly one thing. I had to say it to you before you decided we were finished." He took a deep, shaky breath. "You told Beatrice that our contract was broken if the rumors ruined your standing. You thought I only wanted a wife who was above public reproach. You were completely wrong. I came to Riverwood in October to collect a financial debt. Yes. But then you opened that door, looked me in the eye, and demanded your own terms. I haven't been able to think about anything else since that morning." His pale gray eyes locked onto hers, completely stripped of their usual coldness. "The library, the truth, the 3 months I agreed to them all, because I thought I was simply dealing with a clever girl. But by November, I realized I wasn't humoring you at all. I was being completely undone by a penniless woman who refused to let me hide behind my title, who made my oldest relative laugh, and who looked at my wealth as the least interesting thing about me. I love you, Joan. It isn't in our contract. In fact, I tore up the contract 3 weeks ago." Joan stared at him, her breath catching. "You did what—" "The debt paper was burned in November," Raymond said. "The day I returned your mother's portrait. I went home and destroyed the deed. Riverwood is yours, legally free and clear. There is no obligation between us. There is no power dynamic left. I waited for our 3 months to end so I could ask you to marry me with no leverage, no pressure, so your answer would be based entirely on the truth. But Cynthia moved too quickly, and the time ran out. So I am asking you now, in the middle of a muddy road with nothing to offer you but myself." Joan looked at his large, frozen hands, the hands of the man who had come to take her home, but had stayed to rebuild her life. She stepped across the small patch of snow separating them and placed her bare hands flat against his cold coat. "No more terms," she whispered, her voice finally breaking as the tears she had held back for a year began to fall. "No more clauses. I have spent a full year naming conditions because conditions were the only thing keeping me safe from the cold. I am completely finished with them, Raymond. The answer is yes." Raymond pulled her into his arms, kissing her in the middle of the falling snow, while the town officials watched from the courthouse windows. They were married in March, just as the first green leaves were beginning to break through the gray hedges of the valley. The ceremony was short and quiet, held in the small stone church where Joan's mother was buried. Lady Beatrice sat in the front pew, looking exceptionally pleased with herself, despite her public complaints about the choice of local wildflowers. By June, the cold winter was nothing but a memory. The river ran clear and smooth over its newly repaired dam, and Riverwood House was full of life again. The rooms no longer felt empty. They had filled the library with new books, bought a second armchair so they could read by the fire together, and hired a small local staff to manage the growing farm. On the first truly warm afternoon of the summer, Joan and Raymond walked through the restored garden behind the house. The lilacs had come into full bloom along the old stone wall, filling the warm air with a deep, sweet scent. The bees were humming loudly in the blossoms, creating a peaceful, steady rhythm that belonged entirely to the quiet afternoon. At the steps, which were now completely mended, Raymond offered her his arm. Joan took it, resting her head against his shoulder for a moment, as they looked down the green paths of the property they had saved together. She reached into her pocket and touched the small gold frame of her mother's portrait, feeling a profound sense of peace settle over her. She looked toward the open fields where the new crops were growing straight and tall under the summer sun, and for the first time in her life she didn't feel the need to calculate the risks of tomorrow. The future was no longer a column of figures she had to balance against disaster. It was simply a long, unwritten road that she would walk beside him secure, in the knowledge that some things were worth far more than any ledger could ever hold.